Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Gran Turismo 7. So we're going to continue with our roundup of the 2023 year for GT7. We started off with the top 10 best cars of 23 and now we're going to head over to something probably a little bit more negative with the top 10 worst cars of 2023. Now my list may differ from yours, so don't forget to let me know your top 10 down below. However, just a quick disclaimer, it doesn't necessarily mean that I hate these cars. In fact, I would say there was only really a handful of absolutely bad cars that came this year, but a lot of this is just necessarily based off of maybe they didn't find their place in the game, maybe they were rather quite useful but overall quite boring cars, and you know, maybe some cars just kind of came along, appeared, and then just kind of felt like they disappeared just as quick, just to be completely forgotten about. So with that done and out the way, let's head into it and start our top 10 worst cars of 2023. So in at number 10, I have put the Citroen DS21 Palace. Now the main reason for this vehicle making the top 10 worst cars isn't necessarily that it's a bad car in itself, because it's not. I would go as far to say this is one of the coolest in-game models in the entirety of GT7. This one came very early on in the year in February, alongside some absolutely awesome cars and obviously the VR update, which made this car very, very special at the time. It was insanely detailed, insanely cool to drive in VR, but sadly over time I've just found really no reason to go back to this car. Don't get me wrong, it is a painfully slow car, and even when upgraded, it still remains that kind of way. It's just overall a very slow car, meaning that it just doesn't really have a use in game apart from being an absolutely stunning model. And that's really where the Palace just kind of slips up, just overall being a slow car, very difficult to upgrade and fine tune, and very difficult to really find a place within GT7. Only just making it onto the top 10, like I said, perhaps one of the most detailed cars in the game, but really just lacking that edge in terms of usability. So the DS Palace makes number 10. On to number 9 next, and this is going to be something again a little bit different, and a car that I didn't necessarily want to put on here. This is the R32 GTR Nismo. So this was definitely a car that I didn't want to make the top 10 list. The main reason is because for me personally, I absolutely love this car. But then I started looking back at when this car dropped, how GT7 was doing, and really the car itself. You know, a lot of complaints about this car is that it was just far too copy-paste at a time when GT7 really needed something new and exciting, kind of middle of the year. And then obviously the R32 Nismo dropped and everybody just went, that's a copy-paste waste of a car. A little bit like this Silvias from 2022. We got a bunch of them and it just felt like that's all we were getting. You know, they were very copy and paste. I do admit that in terms of the aero and stuff like that, it is much cooler than the standard GTR, but it doesn't necessarily differ itself enough. So in that way, I do have to kind of go with the majority of people that really did hate this car as soon as it came in for just being far too similar. On to number 8 next, and we're going to do something a little bit different. Now for me, this car, once again, I don't necessarily hate it. I just think it is just more for the kind of timing that this car entered the game. This is the Mazda 3 Group 4 race car. Now don't get me wrong, it is a very fast race car. It did very well in time trials, it does very well in sport mode. Don't get me wrong, it still has the typical quirks of a front wheel drive race car, obviously being very high tyre wear and obviously not necessarily too good on fuel at times. It's very hit and miss, I mean for me personally when I've used it, but overall it's not necessarily a bad car. It just felt like a bit of a waste. There's a lot of people out there that will agree that GT7 needs more race cars, and I don't think really this was a car that anyone would have asked for, and I think that's why I've kind of put it in here in the top 10 list, because again it just feels like a wasted opportunity. We need more kind of real world race cars rather than these fantasy group 4s, especially having a new real world maybe GT4 machine kind of come to the game instead of this would have definitely been a lot cooler. And for me, this kind of car would sit well in its own category away from group 4, maybe being a touring car class. So again, that's my reasoning for it. It doesn't feel like it necessarily fits the overall group 4 vibe, but it's not necessarily a bad car. On to number 7 next, and we're going to go with something once again a little bit on the complete opposite side of the spectrum. This is the Toyota Alphard. Now don't get me wrong, I love the Alphard. It's been a complete joke for me. I ran a league running this car, you know, exclusively. I went drifting in this thing. I've had a ton of fun with it, but once again it kind of suffers from the same problem that the DS Palace has. It's very underpowered. You know, it's not really a car that you can necessarily upgrade and use overall a lot. Don't get me wrong, you can beat Tokyo with it, you can do some of the grinding events with it, but there is a lot more better options out there. So sadly the Alphard just kind of makes it on the list for just being, whilst a relatively amazing and very cool car to use, just overall a little bit on the downside of being too slow, too clunky, and not necessarily able to absolutely get these killer builds out with it. So really does lose a few points there, but overall I genuinely do like the Alphard for what it did. It felt like something different, but again, it felt like a car that kind of came along and disappeared. Moving on to number 6. So this is going to be the Mazda 3 road car, obviously the Burgundy edition. Again, coming on earlier on in the year, it did feel very out of place, and in fact when this car first released it was that bad and that underpowered that I genuinely could not find a tune to be able to go and grind any of the events with, when that was kind of the main thing to do. Don't get me wrong, it is the cheapest of the bunch of these cars. I think at 37,000 credits it's buyable all the time, and obviously nowadays it does have the ability to have that awesome 787B engine swap with, you know, a paired 4-wheel drive system. However, it doesn't make up for just how much disappointment surrounded this car when it first came to the game. You know, most of my memories of this vehicle, whilst they've kind of been, I guess, replaced with better memories with the 787B swap of recent, are just kind of, you know, all about how bad this thing was when it came along, and I really can't get that sour taste out of my mouth. It was very underpowered, even fully upgraded. It really didn't have the ability to keep up with almost anything, and again it just kind of fell for the longest time into the sort of category of very useless cars in GT7. Don't get me wrong, the 787B swap is very cool, but it just doesn't make up for how bad the base fully upgraded version is and how useless it genuinely was when it kind of first came to the game. So that is going to take my number 6 slot. So we're going to move on next to the top 5. So in at number 5, I actually have a much more recent car that came to GT7. This came with obviously Spec 2 update, and I think you could all guess what this is. This is the Tesla Model 3. Now, it isn't necessarily a bad car. I would say the actual base car itself did really kind of shine in terms of the performance. Obviously the 4-wheel drive system, the fact it is an EV vehicle, so, you know, constant acceleration, it's relatively cheap, and don't get me wrong, it is a step up from the Model S, which may be my absolute least favorite car in the entirety of GT7, but again, just in terms of being fully upgraded and stuff, whilst you can get more potential out of the handling and stuff like that, you can't really upgrade the top speed, and it is painfully low. Obviously typically EV, very good on acceleration, painfully low on the overall top speed, and again it just kind of falls into that category of not only being a little bit soulless, but overall mainly just very, or I guess, useless. Now, I'll be the first to admit that EV cars aren't necessarily something that I really kind of gravitate towards too. I do genuinely find them very lifeless, a pretty boring time, you know, just a lack of noise and I guess personality for a lot of these vehicles, and I feel like that really kind of shines through with the Model 3. Once you kind of get over how good the acceleration is and how, you know, cool it is having that 4-wheel drive system, especially when it's launching and such, the rest of the car just feels very kind of tacked on and overall just a little bit lifeless and dull, and I really just can't see past that. So for me, this makes it in at number 5 on our top 10 worst car list of 2023. So let's head over to number 4 next. So this time around, we're going to head all the way back to February and the first update of the year. This is the Italdesign VGT off-road version. Now, for me, this car, I don't necessarily hate it, and I've actually made some decent money running an off-road build. However, I just don't necessarily like this car. I just think it's just absolutely ridiculous. It obviously came alongside the VR update and it doesn't have a cockpit. It just felt like a bit of a really oddball pick and a car that really nobody wanted. Now don't get me wrong, it's kind of paired with a very high price tag of the typical 1 million credits. It just felt like a bit of a complete waste, to be totally honest. And the fact that there's, you know, 2 different versions, the other will come later down the line, spoiler alert. I do think that the off-road one was probably the better of the 2. It just again feels like a waste of time bringing it alongside an update that included the PSVR 2 update. So overall, just a bit of a missed opportunity, a bit of an oddball pick, and a bit of a car that really nobody asked for. But don't get me wrong, it is more useful than the street version. Now in at number 3, I don't necessarily hate this car, and it does kind of take the bronze award for the worst one. This is the High Medic. Don't get me wrong, this is a seriously cool car, but when it kind of comes to having any use in the game, or really driving time, or finding an excuse to actually use this car or vehicle, should I say, there's really none. Don't get me wrong, the sirens are pretty cool, and you know, I guess the detail inside in VR and stuff like that is seriously awesome. And I really do, you know, love what this vehicle, you know, represents. Obviously the emergency services in Japan, but overall, just the vehicle itself, not that good, to be totally honest. It's painfully slow in its standard form, and even when you go ahead and upgrade it, it is still very, very slow and very, very painful to drive. Really does serve no use out of being pretty cool and pretty gimmicky with the sirens and stuff. And then once that's kind of faded away, there's probably really no excuse to actually go back and use the High Medic. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty cool, it's free, you don't have to pay for it, but apart from that, there's really no necessary redeeming features for the High Medic. It's a pretty gimmicky car. Once that passes, I'm pretty sure most of you guys will garage this and then probably realize that you actually have one at the bottom of your list come the end of next year. So there we go, taking the bronze award for 2023 for the worst vehicle goes to the Toyota High Medic. Bit of a gimmick car, nothing really more to say on that. In at number 2, I'm taking our silver award for worst car. I kind of mentioned previously that this car would sort of appear, and here it is. This is the Ital Design VGT street version. I would say this is the weakest of the 2, and again, it suffers from the exact same problems as the off-road version. No cockpit cam, it came alongside a VR update. Overall, just a lot less useful than the off-road version as well. I would say the builds for this one are much weaker in comparison. Overall, just a much more boring car. Don't get me wrong, it is overall faster, but again, it's a bit of a gimmick. Once you've kind of used it once, you'll probably never ever go back to it. Once again, with that high price tag of 1 million credits, typical of a VGT vehicle in GT7, I honestly think that most people will probably avoid this one and not necessarily be looking to use it. Again, it's just an ugly design. It's a weird car, and I just hate it a lot more than I hate the off-road version. Again, just down to its overall usability. I've had more time behind the wheel of the off-road version. Whilst I don't necessarily like it, the street version does top it. So let's have a look at my worst car of 2023 for GT7. And yeah, it's the obviously Gran Turismo movie GTR. Now, you might sat there be saying, you know, this car came along in 2022, and you'd be absolutely correct on that. But there is a reason that this is taking the worst spot, should I say. It's just because it was advertised as its own vehicle at a time when GT7 was at its absolute low point for this year. As you can see from the trailer, they kind of gave it off that this was a new vehicle. Again, it was a free gift car if you kind of logged in, but it just felt like a kick in the teeth when GT7 was at its absolute low point and not really making use of, you know, all the success around the movie and such. It really did feel like a very, very poor excuse. And again, whilst the model itself came in 2022, this vehicle did come available in 2023 and felt like a massive cop-out when people had already done the liveries on them. So there we go. That is my worst top 10 cars of 2023 for GT7. Don't forget to let me know your top 10 down below. I'm very interested to see what you guys kind of gravitated towards or really just outright didn't like. I think I've got a solid list here, and whilst maybe some of those cars towards the early parts of the list I don't necessarily not like, you know, I just think, you know, towards the end of them, a lot of the cars that I just genuinely either didn't have the time for, didn't have an excuse to drive, or just outright hated them. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Peace.